There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from doing exactly what you were told to do and finding that the room is still empty. Imagine standing on a shoreline, trying to secure a massive, heavy iron stake driven into shifting sand, watching the tide pull the grains away from the metal until the very thing meant to hold you starts to lean. We are told to pray, to attend, to serve, and to sacrifice, yet many in the American church today feel as though they are running on a treadmill of spiritual activity that never quite brings them to the finish line. We have the vocabulary of victory, but we carry the quiet weight of a sanctuary that feels like it's waiting for a guest who hasn't arrived. Why does the effort feel so heavy? The writer of Hebrews looks back at a people who understood this weight better than anyone, described in a time when the law was but a shadow of things to come. Every year, the high priest would enter the darkness of the Holy of Holies, carrying the blood of bulls and goats, performing a ritual that had to be repeated the next year and the year after that. It was an annual reminder of sins, a ledger that was never fully cleared, only deferred. If those sacrifices could have made the worshippers perfect, would they not have ceased to be offered? Instead, the blood on the altar served as a recurring proof that the bridge between man and the Almighty had not yet been built. Consider the priest who stands day after day, performing his religious duties, offering the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. It is a picture of a man trying to empty the ocean with a silver cup. The motion is holy, but the result is a stalemate. This is the unease of the religious life, the suspicion that our doing is merely a way to manage our distance from God rather than a way to close it. We find ourselves in a rhythm of repentance and relapse, building a life of faith that feels like a beautiful structure with no foundation. But then the text shifts focus to a body prepared, a single sacrifice offered for all time. He sat down at the right hand of God, an act of finality that no earthly priest was ever allowed to do, for a priest's work was never finished. We are told of a new and living way open through the curtain, which is his flesh. Yet, even with the curtain torn, we find ourselves hesitant to enter. We prefer the shadow to the reality because the shadow demands our effort, while the reality demands our surrender. The author speaks of those who trampled the Son of God underfoot and insulted the Spirit of grace. It is a terrifying warning leveled not at the pagan world, but at the house of God. If the shadow required such reverence, what does the reality demand? This leads us to a question that the modern believer rarely asks. If the sacrifice is finished, why does the life of the faithful look so much like a struggle? The answer begins to emerge in a list of names we've known since childhood. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. We call them heroes, but look closer at the evidence of their lives. Abraham lived in tents as a stranger in a foreign country, looking for a city with foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He held the promise, but he never held the deed to the land. He was a man who had driven his heavy iron stake, driven into shifting sand, refusing to build a permanent house where God had only promised a temporary stay. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They were not looking for a way to make the desert comfortable. They were looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. But they were longing for something better. Their greatness was not in what they achieved, but in what they were willing to lose. We see Moses, who regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. We see those who were stoned, sawn in two, and killed by the sword. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in holes in the ground. We often read this as a tragic history, but the text presents it as a revelation. The cloud of witnesses is not a crowd in a stadium cheering us on. They are the evidence that God's presence is often found exactly where the world's security ends. There is a moment in the text that stops the heart. It is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. We are told we have not come to a mountain that can be touched, burning with fire and gloom, where even an animal touching the slope must be stoned. We have come to Mount Zion. But the God of Zion is the same God as the God of Sinai. He is a consuming fire. That heavy iron stake driven into shifting sand is now the only thing you have to hold on to as the wind begins to rise. You feel it in your own life. The sense that the institutions, the culture, and even the familiar comforts of your local church are being buffeted by a storm you didn't see coming. We look for a way to stabilize the ground, but the word tells us that God is the one doing the shaking. He has promised, "Once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." This shaking is a sorting. It is the removal of what can be shaken created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. The anxiety we feel when the world shifts beneath our feet is not a sign of God's absence. It is the process of His kingdom becoming visible. The things we thought were permanent are revealed to be temporary, and the things we thought were invisible are revealed to be the only things that are real. Therefore let us go to Him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace He bore. In the ancient world, the sin offering was burned outside the gates of the city in the place of waste and shame. Jesus did not die in the temple, He died at the garbage dump. To find Him, we have to leave the safety of the camp, the social structures and religious comforts that promise us a city here. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. The heavy iron stake driven into shifting sand was never meant to hold a tent together forever. It was a marker for a traveler who knew the wind was coming. When the earth finally shakes and the sand is blown away, the stake isn't found to be leaning. It is found to be driven into the bedrock that was hidden beneath the surface all along. We are receiving a kingdom that cannot be moved. Will you stop trying to steady the sand and finally start trusting the bedrock?